to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be focusing on a wide range of topics, but the most important is to how to abolish war. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Dr. Winston Langley is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and he's a Senior Fellow at McCormack Graduate School in Policy and Global Studies. He's written widely on the United Nations, disarmament, human rights, and women's rights in the United States. Dr. Winston Langley, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
I'm very pleased to be with you, Bill, and look forward to our engagement.
Thank you, and we're going to jump right into it. Your recent book was Abolishing War. What is the main theme of that book, and why is it so important?
Because I think we are being governed, the world at large, by what I call the culture of war. One that essentially states that conflicts ought to be resolved, international conflicts ought to be resolved militarily. It is important because it introduces to us the fact that we have been living under the auspices of a collective slaughter, unending collective slaughter of human beings. Morally, we say that it is inexcusable, but we continue the insult against all our sense of human dignity. And it places a degree of heroism, false heroism, on this culture. Finally, it has something to do with an obligation we assumed after World War II, when over 77 million human beings were slaughtered, namely to save succeeding generations from the scourge, from the calamity, from the plague of war. And we have not done it.
That's very true. You're quite right. And I'm glad you brought up to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war,
Yes.
Which was the first of the three goals for establishing the United Nations in 1945. Well, before I forget it, I do want to mention your website at www.winstonlangley.com for our viewers who would like to go and get additional information on what we're talking about today and some of the items we may not get to today in our 24-minute time of talking. But let's get right into this. You mentioned a culture of war. I think you're absolutely right. I know the United Nations years ago came up with the culture of peace concept. Yes. I think it was UNESCO. I can't remember exactly, but I think they were the ones who came up with it, or maybe it was the Secretary General, a culture of peace. What do you see as some of the components of this culture of war? Is it the military-industrial complex, or our readiness to just be macho and go to war at the drop of a hat, or what are some of the components of this?
Yes, it has several components to it, one of which I just mentioned, making a hero of those who are practitioners of the craft, or the art of warfare. It has quite a bit to do with a collusion that President Eisenhower warned us about, the military-industrial complex, but that has expanded to include a broader complex, which is called the MIMAC complex, military, industrial, media, academic complex. Since so much of academic work in security and political studies has had to do with justifying the militarization of our life. And the media that is supposed to help us has been caught because of a model it has, namely pleasing advertisers who themselves are often linked to this complex, makes it difficult for us to move on to the abolition of war as it ought to be, and as demonstrable is quite possible.
Yes, and that is very, very true. So often we have these military experts, talking heads, talking about Ukraine or talking about Yemen or wherever it might be.
Yeah.
And so many of them, a lot of them are retired, but a lot of them are on the boards of directors of Raytheon, Boeing, the producers of these military arms that we're using. And so there's a direct conflict there. But I'm glad you mentioned the academics too, because they, I think, have a responsibility, just like the media, to point out the horrors of war. But do you find that so many of these academics are more interested in proving their particular theory or validating their findings as opposed to actually alerting the public and educating the public as to how horrific warfare is?
Yes, indeed. I think they have foregone their social and moral responsibility and substituted in their stead what is really a series of self-justifying effort, namely to prove that their own theorizing is being supported by ongoing developments in the world at large, which is not difficult indeed, because one can predict the consequences of the ongoing system that we have, namely, we mentioned the culture of war.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to get into it shortly as to what can be done to abolish war, but looking back, or getting a little historical overview,
Yeah.
I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this, but there's a Westphalian order
Yes.
that was created. Very briefly, what is the Westphalian order, and how is that going to help us avoid wars?
Indeed, the Westphalian order is the source of the continuing warfare that we are experiencing. It is named after a 1648 treaty. It was concluded in Westphalia, what is then part of Germany. And what it did was to end what was a 30 years war, religious war as it were, because of the conflicts between secular and political authorities then. Religion was contesting the emerging secular authority. And states were seen as entitled to accredit diplomats to defend their territories and to exercise sovereignty, which is an attribute of the state. The states are the only entities that possess it. That says they do not recognize any higher authority at all. And as long as this principle operates, we will have warfare, because the false peace about which we speak is brought about only by the overwhelming military domination of one or a group of states of other human beings who find it properly intolerable.
And the Westphalian order is one of the protocol that created the sovereignty, as you mentioned, for individual states, and that has proven to be a major roadblock to the United Nations being able to accomplish a lot of what it attempts to undertake. But we're going to be talking about all of that in just a moment.
Yes.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with the PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer. You like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at some of these international issues, especially how we can abolish war. My guest today is an expert on these topics. Dr. Winston Langley is Professor Emeritus of the Department of Political Science and International Relations and a Senior Fellow at McCormack Graduate School for Public and Global Studies. He's written widely on the United Nations, disarmament, human rights, and women's rights in the United States. Dr. Langley, let's go right into it. What can we do to abolish war, to eliminate war, to stop first of all, I guess stop glorifying it, and which every country seems to do that when they get involved into a conflict. But what can we do? Can we strengthen the United Nations? Can we have better educational programs in our schools? Or what are 4 or 5 things we can do to help us get out of this culture of war?
First, I think we need to be aware that war has been abolished between formerly warfaring groups. One may use the United States, one may use China, one may use Germany and France as examples. In case of the US, for example, before 1789, we had problems. We had what is called a confederation of states. Each of these states was sovereign. And the only way the confederal government got financial support was to have a voluntary contribution by its members. It had no authority to regulate commerce. It had no authority to regulate warfare. So Delaware and Pennsylvania were at war. New York and New Jersey was about to go to war about regulating the port of New York, about who will collect the customs there. What happened in 1789 was that the states agreed that they will transfer their sovereignty to the federal government, and they could have war against each other. The federal government would regulate commerce, and the federal government, in fact, would be able to tax. Some taxing authority, as it were. We have that as an example. We could look at the same thing with France and Germany. Germany and France existed under a single emperor for a while, Charlemagne, as he was called in France, and Karl the Große, as he was called in Germany. He's the same person. And then when he died, then how do you deal with the territories? And from 800 to 1945, Germany and France was at war. In fact, they were the principal sources of conflict in Europe. After World War II, a decision was made to bring Germany and France together as the core of a broader European unity. They created what is called the European Coal and Steel Community. And emerging from that is what we today call the European Union. It has not completed the process, but it has eliminated war between those two parties. The United Nations is where the United States was before 1789. We have a confederal structure without the authority to impose a tax, to regulate commerce, or to prevent war. We have the legal framework from which that may be developed, but it was never put into operation. And so the goal of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war has never been achieved. All we have to do is to reform the United Nations and put in place the proper mechanisms to have it operate as originally envisioned, and that is part of what the work does, and I shall be glad to go into the specifics of how that can take place.
Yes, if you would, please mention a few of them. Of course, when they think of reform at the UN, or the UN has reformed itself as far as its efficiency and effectiveness quite dramatically over the past 15, 20 years. But one area that we've been debating for decades now has been the Security Council, and the fact that 5 of the 15 members have veto power, and some of the larger countries, the more influential countries today, like Brazil and India, different ones like that, are not able to have a permanent seat on the Security Council. But what would you recommend? Is the Security Council a good place to start? Or are there other areas of the UN to start to reform?
I have moved for some reforms in the Security Council, substantial reforms in the Secretariat and the General Assembly, as well as the International Court of Justice and the economic system throughout the world. I'll touch on a few for you, and you can tell me when I've gone too far.
Okay, we'll do that. Okay.
I have concluded that the five permanent members, what are called the P5, are not about to give up any of the power of veto that they currently have. And therefore, the reforms I'm suggesting is a way to get around what I see as that reluctance. One is to expand the Security Council from its current membership of 15 to 25, and to add non-permanent but long-term membership to those additional members. That would include perhaps what you refer to, India, for example, Japan, Indonesia, Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, Mexico, but these what are called middle-range states. They would be given 6-year tenure on the council, and they could be re-elected indefinitely, providing their voting pattern expresses compliance with the terms of the charter. So they are going to be measured every 6 years, as it were. We would continue the 2-year membership, what are called non-permanent members, and the P5 would continue. Something else would take place, however. During the Korean War, we had what is called a Uniting for Peace resolution that empowers the General Assembly with the authority to assume a number of the powers of the Security Council if there were a deadlock in that body, namely the use of the veto. With the new members who are non-permanent but having larger armies that can contribute to the operations of the UN and larger economic budgets also, in collaboration with the General Assembly, when there is the use of the veto to allow action on the part of the UN, the General Assembly would now step in with the authority conferred in the 1950s under the Uniting for Peace resolution. A series of other proposals are introduced because in case of the Secretary General, for example, the P5, since the death of Dag Hammarskjöld in the early 1960s, has been directed at manipulating the tenure of members of the Secretariat in such a way that their independence is impaired. And that impairment comes in many ways, but one of the major ones is that they can only be re-elected for a second 5-year term if they are seen by the Security Council as having acted in a manner consistent with the interest of the P5. How a Secretary General gets elected is that the name is proposed by the Security Council, and then the General Assembly votes. If no one is proposed by the Security Council, then there's no one on whom to vote. The reform here would be to eliminate a second term and have but one term of 7 years. And there would not be the jockeying for a second term and having to cater to the interest of the members of the Security Council. The General Assembly can make that reform if it so elects. A third area of reform would be currently the International Court of Justice does not deal with cases brought by individuals, only states and international organizations. We would reform the International Court of Justice to see that it takes cases dealing with individuals. As an alternative, we suggest that the General Assembly create a parallel court dealing with human rights, so that appeals from national settings or regional settings, for example, Europe has the European Court of Human Rights, to the United Nations Court of Human Rights, and then we'd have thereby a greater popularity of the UN. We'd have a final say on decisions having to do with human rights, and the rule of law will become more uniform and enforceable globally.
Those are excellent suggestions, and I hope that the leaders of the world are listening to you, and I hope that they pick up a copy of your book, Abolishing War, because we need to focus on this topic. It is so important, and you've come up with some really solid, concrete recommendations today that we need to be doing differently in this country and in other countries around the world too, not just us. But to stop glorifying war, to let people know exactly what it means to go to war, to talk about all of the suffering and pain and bills and debts that occur. We saw it in Iraq with the illegal invasion of Iraq by George W. Bush.
Yes.
We saw over 5,000 Americans killed, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, $2 trillion wasted on looking for weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. So we see the negative repercussions, but these were excellent recommendations. And again, Dr. Winston Langley, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Oh, I'm very pleased. I'm sorry we did not get to matters of climate change and the environment, etc., or to the reforms of the world financial system, but I'm pleased to have had a chance to say what the time allowed us to.
Thank you. We will do that our next interview, because
I hope that will be the case.
Important topics. But again, thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
I'm Bill Miller. Thanks for joining us today on Global Connections Television.